By the time President Richard Nixon reached the White House, he had ruled out a military victory in Vietnam. But he wasn't about to admit defeat. The new president promised to secure peace with honor and would demonstrate that the American war machine was far from finished. His point man on the war was National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger. Together, the two men led the nation through its final, painful chapter in Vietnam. At the core of the White House strategy was the policy of Vietnamization. What this really meant was that the United States was handing the war back to South Vietnam. American money and air support would continue, but U.S. ground troops would be withdrawn, and the burden of day-to-day fighting would shift to the South Vietnamese army. It would not end the war for the U.S., but it would end the most unpopular aspect of it. But even as the first contingent of American troops were leaving Vietnam, Nixon was plotting to expand the war. With peace negotiations at a standstill, he encouraged his advisors to think big, to consider new options, even nuclear weapons. Henry Kissinger advocated for a savage blow, adding, "I refuse to believe that a little fourth-rate power like North Vietnam doesn't have a breaking point." Another advisor said such harsh military action would amount to shooting our way out of the saloon. Nixon decided to launch air raids against enemy sanctuaries in neighboring Cambodia, bragging that he would bomb the communists back to the bargaining table. He hid the illegal operations from the American people and Congress for 3 years. A year later, Nixon announced that American forces were invading Cambodia to seek out and destroy communist command and control centers. The president said it was a demonstration of American resolve.
If, when the chips are down, the world's most powerful nation, the United States of America, acts like a pitiful, helpless giant, the forces of totalitarianism and anarchy will threaten free nations and free institutions throughout the world.
Nixon's announcement triggered the angriest protests of the war. At Kent State University, demonstrators faced off with Ohio National Guardsmen. Before it was over, 4 students were dead. 10 days later, the scene was repeated in Mississippi. Richard Nixon had campaigned on the pledge to end the war and win the peace. But to the dismay of many Americans, he had extended the conflict into Cambodia and fanned the flames of dissent at home. Like 4 presidents before him, Nixon was stuck in Vietnam. No way to win, no way out, no way to save face. In March 1972, with only 6,000 American troops remaining in South Vietnam, the North Vietnamese Army launched their largest assault since the Tet Offensive 4 years earlier. The Easter Offensive, as it was called, quickly crushed South Vietnamese defenses in the northern province of Quang Tri. A second wave swept across the central highlands to the coast. A final thrust hit the area just north of Saigon. More than 1 million South Vietnamese fled to escape the attacks. With American arms and massive American air support, the South Vietnamese army blocked the enemy offensive. But it took 6 full months to recapture the territory lost to the communists. Saigon escaped the destruction of the Easter Offensive, but that was overshadowed by news that the Americans might soon be leaving altogether. Without the knowledge of the South Vietnamese, Henry Kissinger had been secretly negotiating with his counterpart from North Vietnam, Le Duc Tho. After more than 2 years, the two had reached an agreement for a ceasefire. The Saigon government protested that they had been sold out by the Americans and flatly rejected the truce. Negotiations collapsed. With his elusive peace with honor slipping away, Nixon ordered a final, ferocious round of bombings. Over 11 days in December, American B-52s dropped more than 40,000 tons of bombs on North Vietnam. The administration claimed their targets were purely military, but civilian centers were hit as well. One White House aide called it calculated barbarism. The carnage was enough to restart negotiations. Kissinger and Le Duc Tho returned to Paris on January 8th. By the following day, they reached an agreement to end the fighting in Vietnam.
A ceasefire, internationally supervised, will begin at 7 p.m. this Saturday, January 27, Washington time. Within 60 days from this Saturday, all Americans held prisoners of war throughout Indochina will be released. There will be the fullest possible accounting for all of those who are missing in action. During the same 60-day period, all American forces will be withdrawn from South Vietnam. The people of South Vietnam have been guaranteed the right to determine their own future without outside interference.
The United States had arrived in South Vietnam to help the government defend itself against foreign aggression, to defend freedom and democracy, to stop the dominoes from falling. Now, just as foreign invaders had done for centuries, they were leaving. For the Vietnamese, the struggle continued. In accordance with the ceasefire agreements, North Vietnam's troops were allowed to remain in the South. South Vietnam refused to acknowledge their legitimacy and prepared for more bloodshed. President Nixon promised American aid would continue and that the U.S. would respond with full force if the communists violated the ceasefire. But Nixon's presidency was coming unraveled. Congressional hearings revealed the president and his staff had waged an illegal war on the home front against political opponents, members of the media, leaders of the anti-war movement. Crimes had been committed. Congress threatened impeachment.
We have reached the moment when we are ready to debate resolution calling for the impeachment of Richard M. Nixon.
Mr. Danielson.
Aye.
Mr. Drinan.
Aye.
Mr. Rangel.
Aye.
Miss Jordan.
Aye.
Mr. Smith.
No.
Mr. Sandman.
No.
Mr. Railsback.
Aye.
Mr. Rodino.
Aye.
For President Nixon, it was the end of the line.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
With the American government in turmoil, the communist leaders in Hanoi saw their opportunity to reunite the country by force. They launched what would be their final offensive in early 1975. The North Vietnamese army struck first at Ba Ma Thuot, the first step in cutting the South in half. South Vietnamese defenses collapsed almost immediately. The new American president, Gerald Ford, petitioned Congress for aid to help South Vietnam. He said it was America's moral responsibility. Congress refused. The communists rolled on. By the end of March, they had captured Tam Kỳ, Quang Ngai, and Hue. 2 million refugees fled to Da Nang. Trapped by the advancing communist army, they thronged to airports, docks, and beaches. only 50,000 escaped before the city was overrun by the North Vietnamese. The capital city of Saigon was in panic. Thousands jammed the courtyard of the U.S. Embassy, desperate for protection. On April 29th, with the Saigon airport already under communist control, the U.S. set in motion the largest helicopter evacuation in history. Over the next day, Marine helicopters shuttled more than 7,000 people from the beleaguered capital to U.S. aircraft carriers waiting offshore. The next day, the communists arrived in Saigon and stormed through the gates of the presidential palace. It had taken more than 20 years, but they had achieved their goal of victory, independence, and unity.